Imagine what it might be like to live in a country where the government has declared war on working people.
The unions have been incredibly militant.
Where the government plans to rob millions of workers of their democratic right to strike.
This government wants to reduce the ability of strikers.
Where the government plans to force nurses, doctors, teachers, rail workers and many others to work against their will and allow them to be sacked if they refuse.
We need to crack on and pass a piece of legislation that means that unions will be, if they strike, they still have to provide a minimum level of service on critical infrastructure like our railways, because they should not be allowed to hold the country to ransom in the way they are.
And imagine a government willing to outright lie to the public to get away with it. It's unthinkable, isn't it? But that's exactly what's happening in our country right now.
We're going to bring forward new laws in common with countries like France, Italy, Spain and others.
It's a statement the Prime Minister has now made in Parliament many times.
They're present in France, in Italy, in Spain.
He's also sent out members of his government to repeat it.
Lots of other European countries have these, so when people say it's undemocratic, it is something that they have in France, they have in Italy, they have in Spain.
But what the Prime Minister wants is for nurses, doctors, firefighters, teachers, rail and border staff to be sacked if they refuse to comply with minimum service levels during industrial action. That's not the case in France, Italy and Spain. So what Sunak is planning is dramatically different.
France, Spain, Italy and others.
There are many other differences too. The minimum service legislation in France has never been deployed for transport strikes, but that's set to be the case in the UK. And that's not all. In France, minimum service levels are agreed through negotiations with trade unions. But the government's minimum service bill will allow the business secretary to decide statutory minimum service levels without negotiation with trade unions. It effectively allows the business secretary to write minimum service regulations of an unknown kind to force people to work against their will, robbing them of their democratic right to withdraw their labour and allowing them to be sacked if they refuse. It's unthinkable, unworkable and almost certainly illegal.
A number of trade unions have said that this will affect their members' human rights. What do you say to that?
Look, I don't think that's right.
But the Joint Committee on Human Rights has found the government's anti-strike bill fails to meet the UK's human rights obligations.
We clearly have a problem with human rights law in this country that is making it difficult for us to achieve our objectives.
They don't even try to hide it anymore.
That ensure that we have minimum levels of safety in critical areas like fire, like ambulance, so that even when strikes are going on, you know that your health will be protected.
But unions representing health workers never strike in the absence of agreeing minimum service provision with employers on a voluntary and mutual basis. Here is the Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove confirming it.
I'm conscious that ambulance workers, nurses and others, when they do go on strike action, and I don't approve of it, I have to say, but they do take steps in order to ensure that they can look after the most urgent emergency cases.
And here is the Energy Secretary, Grant Shapps.
So you had the Royal College of Nursing, who, in the nurses' strike, did agree at a national level what the minimum safety level would be.
What the government is doing is deliberately conflating minimum safety levels with minimum service levels in order to create confusion for the public. This bill will significantly restrict the democratic right of workers to strike in education, in transport, in border security and other sectors, robbing millions of workers of their basic right to withdraw their labour and allow employers to sack those who won't submit. For any government to suggest lives are likely to be lost if a train doesn't run or a teacher walks out or there's a queue at Heathrow is completely insane. Conservative MPs know that, but still back the Prime Minister's war on workers and voted for the government's anti-strike bill anyway.
But in the past week, we can measure ourselves by actions. What have we done on this side of the House? We've introduced new powers to curb disruptive protests. We're protecting public services against undisruptive strike action, Mr. Speaker.
That was the UK Prime Minister actually boasting to Parliament and cheering MPs that he's just stripped back the public's right to protest and robbed millions of workers of their democratic right to strike.
Striking workers don't benefit from strikes.
Without our trade unions and the workers willing to back them with strike action when needed, we wouldn't have a minimum wage. Maternity and paternity rights, pension provision, holiday and sickness entitlements, victories which have benefited every single person in this country. After a decade of almost completely unprecedented wage stagnation, workers in the UK are £11,000 a year worse off. 2022 was the worst year for real wage growth in nearly half a century. Average real wages in the UK will actually be lower in 2026 than they were in 2008. And at the very moment workers across the country stand together and say enough is enough, the Prime Minister, who thinks it's a terrific idea to uncap bonuses for millionaire bankers and impose crappy real terms pay cuts on public sector workers, plans to rob those who won't submit of their right to strike. Well, absolute bollocks to that. Workers across the country must stand together. We can't allow a single worker to be sacked for defending their pay and conditions. The entire trade union movement must rally behind any worker sacked for exercising their fundamental right to strike.